Welcome everyone to Humanist Canada's webinar series. My name is Anna Popovich. I'm Program Director at Humanist Canada, and I will moderate today's conversation with Jim. This webinar will be 19 minutes in length, a 60-minute presentation followed by a 30-minute Q&A. If you have a question for the speaker, you can ask it directly. Please raise your hand and I will ask you to unmute yourself. You can also submit your question with the Q&A tool at the bottom of your screen, and you can upvote a question of your choice. Our very timely topic today is technology and future jobs, how to make technology work for workers. And I'm pleased and honored to welcome Dr. Jim Stanford, Director of the Center for Future Work and one of Canada's best-known economists. Jim served for over 20 years as economist and director of policy with Canada's largest private sector trade union, Unifor, formerly the Canadian Auto Workers. He is quoted frequently in the print and media and writes a regular column for the Toronto Star. He is also the Harold Innes Industry Professor in Economics at McMaster University and an honorary professor in the Department of Political Economy at the University of Sydney. Jim received his PhD in economics from the New School for Social Research in New York. He also holds an MPhil in economics from Cambridge University and the BA in economics from the University of Calgary. He is the author of Economics for Everyone, a short guide to the economics of capitalism, published in 6 languages, as well as dozens of articles and reports. Jim has provided research and advice through numerous federal and provincial government panels and inquiries on economic policy, innovation, jobs, and social policy. Welcome, Jim, and thank you so much for joining us. It's a pleasure to have you.
Anna, thank you and your whole team at Canada's Humanists for the invitation to join you in the webinar today, and also for everything you do. I follow the Humanists Association, have for years, and it's wonderful what you do, the services you provide, but also the perspective you bring to our life and our culture and our society. And I'm very much, I think, motivated by a desire to help build a humanist economics. In fact, where we put human needs at the center of how we understand the economy and what we try to do with the economy. And I think that is actually the fundamental goal of economics. Not about, GDP, rates of return, but our human condition and, of course, the condition of the environment around us. So please keep on your great work. I do want to acknowledge I'm joining you from Vancouver, and I'm on the unceded terrain here of the Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh First Nations, and I want to acknowledge their title here and thank them for sharing their land with me. And I want to thank the audience. I want to thank you folks for taking a Friday night to come and listen to an economist. Wow, that's bravery. That kind of sounds like a Stephen King novel or something, doesn't it? Just when you thought it was safe to go out after COVID, along comes The Economist. And usually people's eyes glaze over when they start to think about economics, but I reject that and I rebuff that. I think economics should be accessible, it should be understandable, and it should be about our day-to-day lives, not about the ups and downs of the stock market. So they do say, however, I should warn you that an economist is someone who's good with numbers and didn't have the personality to become an accountant. So, I'll just leave that with you as a fair warning. That's kind of my version of the safe harbor statement, that comes on after an ad for RRSPs or something. We always say, past returns are no guarantee of future performance. Well, that was my safe harbor statement. Okay, well, I'm going to share some slides as I go through this presentation on technology and the future of jobs. Just give me a second here while I get the technology up and running here. Anna, that looks okay. I hope you can see the cover slide and everything.
Yep, perfect.
Great stuff. Okay, well, let's jump into this. Technology and jobs and making technology work for workers. As Anna mentioned, I come from a trade union background. I worked as a union economist for years. And now our think tank, the Center for Future Work, is all about work and the future of work and labor and wages and fairness and security. So technology is a big issue that we take on. I would like to encourage folks to visit our website, centerforfuturework.ca. We have an office in Vancouver. We also have an office in Australia. And we've got all our reports there, are open access, and we've done a lot of work on climate transitions, the economics of childcare, technology, and how do we shape it, of course, COVID and its impact on work and labor markets and other projects. So also at that site, you can sign up for our contact list if you'd like to be notified of future studies. You're also welcome to join the conversation on social media. There's my Twitter handle and the center's Twitter handle. You're welcome to post on social media from tonight's presentation if you'd like. You can share your findings with everyone else who's got nothing else to do on a pandemic Friday night except listen to an economist. We always hear about technology and the future work, and we hear some incredible propositions, some of them very dystopian, that technology is going to replace all of our jobs and humans will have nothing left. Some of them very utopian, namely technology will mean we've got so much leisure time, we won't know how to fill it, and we'll pay out guaranteed annual income to everyone. And there's a big difference between the hype of technology, if you like, the incredible things that we think technology can do, and the rather grim reality that often affects how we experience so-called technology and so-called innovation. I am always agog at the fact that one of the industries that claims that it's innovative and on the technological frontier are these gig platforms, which hire workers to do some of the most menial, low-tech things imaginable, like delivering fast food to people on a bicycle. That is not high tech, okay? There is technology in the world, but that's not it. The bicycle was invented about 150 years ago. And, restaurants and fast food and so on have been around for almost as long. So the difference between the hype and the reality is important to sort through, and including to firmly and forcefully reject the assumption that technology drives these changes. I absolutely reject the sense of technological determinism that infiltrates a lot of these discussions, and I hope that as humanists you do as well, because you're all about the human, and it is human beings, not machines, that determine how technology unfolds. What are the problems that we try to solve with new technology? And then how do we apply technology in our lives and share the costs and benefits of it? Those are the reasons I come to this with a very skeptical view about technology. Not both, what its downsides will be, but also, is it even really that new and really that important? So this idea, is technology the villain or the savior of our future of work? And obviously, there are some incredible things that technology can do to improve our lives. The most miraculous and wonderful one these days is how quickly we invented vaccines against COVID. And it's just stunning that we could have a situation where most people in Canada, and not enough around the world, but more all the time, have been vaccinated against a disease that could cause a serious illness or death. And to have that problem addressed and not solved, but certainly vaccines help us manage it so quickly, is an astounding testament to human ingenuity. And by the way, it's not that we should get down on our hands and knees and pray and give thanks to the pharmaceutical giants that are actually, branding and unrolling these things. Their work was not just the company, it was obviously the workers and scientists there, but of course it took advantage of a whole framework of scientific knowledge that was built up, including through public research and development. And by the way, the public's paying for the whole thing. This is not, again, a triumph of pharmaceutical capitalism. This is a triumph of human ingenuity, is what it is, and it's wonderful. At the same time, we can look around and see other examples of technology run amok. And one of the most dystopian would be a high-tech warehouse for Amazon, I think last count, fifth most valuable company in the world, and the fifth largest employer in the world. And you got a situation where their business has boomed and their market value has boomed because of the pandemic, people getting stuff at home. And the warehouses are like a nightmare in terms of how technology is applied to lean and mean and direct and supervise the minute to minute, never mind minute to minute, second to second actions of people working in those warehouses, where technology guides them to where they're supposed to be, pick the right box off the right shelf, and then without a moment's notice, go on to the next one. And the dangers of this for physical health, repetitive strain injuries, mental health from the stress, COVID transmission, of course. Amazon warehouses have been hotspots. Terrible. And to think that a company that is perhaps one of the handful of most profitable companies in the world can't afford to treat the human beings who work there better is a damning indictment on how we've organized our system. I will note that trade unions are trying to organize the Amazon workers and give them some collective voice and some collective power, including in Canada. And that is something that I think is important and will help in some way to counterbalance that power. So technology can be great and technology can be horrible. The question is, who's in charge of the technology and what problems are we trying to solve with it? Technology is not an external exogenous force. It's not like there's some kind of logic that we just have to follow. Technology is simply human knowledge about how to do things. In particular, how do we use tools and our brains and our brawn to produce goods and services that are useful and valuable and enhance our lives. That's what technology is. It isn't something outside of us. It is our knowledge about how to do different stuff and do it better. And it doesn't have a predetermined trajectory. In fact, technology arises from putting people to work trying to solve problems. And so what problems get solved and how they get solved depends on who put them to work, who paid for the researchers, who paid for the engineers, what problems were they trying to solve. We've got all kinds of technology that we can imagine on our smartphone apps. There's an app for everything these days. So how come there's no app that can keep track of whether every worker in the country is being paid at least the minimum wage? That seems to be a problem that could be solved with an app, but there isn't one. Why not? Instead, there's an app that tells the employer, whether it's Amazon or some other employer, exactly where you are at any point in time and how long you spent in the bathroom. There's no app to tell them to figure out if you're getting paid the minimum wage or not, but there is an app to scrutinize and supervise your minute-to-minute actions as a worker. And in that regard, technology depends on who's in charge. That's all there is to it. I'm going to organize my presentation this evening around 5 kind of themes and 5 kind of conventional wisdoms that I'm going to poke at with this kind of skeptical attitude that I've mentioned about technology. 5 common beliefs that I don't think are fully justified. First of all, this big red herring that technology is going to eliminate our jobs and there will be no work left. This is, in a way, the frightening claim that's put out there, and it's not true. It's not going to happen. It can't happen. The economy cannot function without work and without workers. Secondly, even just the assumption that technology is accelerating and technology is omnipresent and technology is everywhere. I'm not so sure about that, and I'll explain why. The third kind of urban myth that I want to take on about technology is that it's not so much about productivity, and how efficient we are producing things. Some of the biggest impacts of technology in the world of work is felt via relationships, human relationships between workers and other workers, between workers and their employers, workers and their bosses, workers and customers. And shaping those relationships more than actually changing what we produce, in many cases, is what technology is all about. And sometimes those impacts are very negative. I'll take a special swipe at the gig economy, or what was once known as the sharing economy. That had to be the worst euphemism in the history of the English language, the sharing economy. Uber is worth something like $75 billion US on the stock market at last count, even though it's never made $1 in profit, not $1 in profit, and probably never will. And yet the wealth isn't being shared at all with the people who actually drive Uber or deliver Uber Eats. So I will take a deep dive into this whole phenomenon of gig work and what it means and what's new about it and what isn't new about it. Last of all, I want to take a look at skills and technology and jobs, and in a way challenge the sort of misplaced faith that the way to handle the problems posed to work and workers by technology is just to get the right skills, retrain yourself, learn how to code, or learn some other skill that's going to be in high demand, and that will make everything feasible. And that theme runs through a lot of our policy discussions about technology and work and how we manage. Okay, so let's look at the first one. Workers are going to be replaced by machines, and the robots will make us all unemployed. The reality is that cannot happen. Work cannot disappear from our economy. The whole process of the economy can be described as a simple chain of events where we take some resources from nature, okay? Resources that hopefully we learn how to harvest in a sustainable way so that we don't degrade and exhaust the potential of our natural environment that we were gifted with. But everything starts with nature, including the fact that we need a place to work and live, and air to breathe, and water to drink, and materials to harvest from nature. From that point on, everything that's added is human effort, productive human effort, or work, as it's sometimes known as, a four-letter word, work. And on Monday morning, it feels like a four-letter word, doesn't it? Everything from that point on is human beings using their brains and their brawn, their capacity to think and conceptualize and solve problems, and their capacity to move physical items around. And that human effort transforms the free gifts of nature that we harvest and transforms them into the whole plethora of useful goods and services that we consume that allow us to survive and thrive. The whole economy is nothing more than the sum total of work that human beings do. And that's true in an automated factory as it is in a manual process of digging ditches. In both cases, it's human work that drove the whole process. The difference is how that human work was organized and directed. If you have a very automated factory, you've still got work happening. It's just the work happened in different places, in indirect places, rather than right there on the factory floor. Some human beings had to conceive of those machines and robots, engineer them, design them, manufacture them, install them, maintain them, provide the inputs to those machines, and all of that took work. Now, it might be more efficient, it might be more productive by doing it that way, rather than trying to produce things with our bare hands. We can be a lot more efficient and get a lot more goods and services out there. But it isn't a question of work disappearing, it's a question of work happening in a different place in the whole chain of production. So we are given two things to start with in the economy. One is those natural resources that we harvest, again, hopefully sustainably from nature. The other is our brains and our brawn, our capacity to work. And what we have learned since we descended from the trees 200,000 years ago in East Africa somewhere is that the best thing to do first with the natural resources and our labor is to make some tools, okay? And these are known as intermediate products. So that could be in the olden days, taking a stone and breaking it in a way that it created a sharp edge that allowed us to cut things with. Taking sticks and converting them into some kind of simple shelter. Taking the hides of animals that we were able to hunt and converting them into clothes. Those are all tools that allowed us to do our work more efficiently. And then, with the help of that tool, we apply more labor and usually more natural resources and the use of the tool in order to produce the end product that we wanted. And the whole process of automation simply means we use more tools, more of that intermediate step in the production, and less labor in the direct production of the end product. But it's still labor and natural resources driving the whole thing. And you can take any product in society and decompose it into those two primary inputs, natural resources and human labor. And the idea that human labor can be replaced is nonsense. Human labor could become much more efficient and produce a lot more stuff with less work. That sounds like a good thing as long as we manage it well. But work is not dispensable. And from a trade union perspective, I was always at pains to try and put workers at the center of the economic formula rather than in the disposable productive input. We aren't disposable. If we weren't there, this system wouldn't work. And I think that is a different way of looking at the economy that shares the power a bit more. So there's even evidence out there about whether work and workers are being replaced as the economy carries on and technology moves forward. For sure, it's possible in an automated facility to use machines and robots to produce more stuff with less direct labor at the end. But there's lots of factors that offset that. One that I've already mentioned is all the work that goes into designing and manufacturing and installing and maintaining the tools themselves. That didn't happen by itself. That happened through work. Another offsetting factor is you've got new jobs and industries that are enabled by the new technology. The technology can open up whole new things like programming apps for our phones. That didn't even exist as an industry not so long ago. And now it employs hundreds of thousands of people around the world. We can also increase the total output if we wanted. If the productivity of new machinery allowed us to produce a lot more, then we could keep people working and just produce more than we used to. And there's some cases where that makes sense and allows us to have a higher standard of living. Or the alternative is to just produce as much as we did before, but do it with less work time. And so a crucial potential benefit of technological advancement and higher productivity is reducing the work time over time. And we used to do that. We went from working 12 hours a day, 7 days a week, down to what a normal work week was considered 7 or 8 hours a day, 5 days a week, as well as paid vacation and holidays and chances for parental leave and learning leaves and other things, as well as being able to retire before we died. Those were all ways to reduce your lifetime working hours, and they were all built on the productivity that came from new technology and new investment. More recently, this tendency to reduce working hours has been kind of held up or blocked, mostly because employers don't want people to work shorter working hours, except for the proportion of the workforce who are stuck in very insecure, precarious jobs, people who are given a few hours here and a few hours there, not so that they can enjoy life with greater leisure time, but rather so they can be a source of cheap, flexible labor. So that shorter working hours issue, I think, is one we have to put back on the agenda with discussions about technology. At any rate, the evidence on these offsetting effects, sometimes you're replaced by a robot, but there's other jobs that come into play. The offsetting effect seems to be pretty much a wash, or if anything, more investment in technology tends to be associated with more employment. So it's a net positive. Despite that, you see certainly cases where entire industries or entire occupations can be disrupted and dislocated, whether that's a person working in a video store, which doesn't exist anymore, and that was thousands of people. Another one that's going to happen is people working in auto mechanic shops. As we move to electric vehicles, most of those jobs are going to disappear. To jobs in the fossil fuel industry, which is also going to disappear, in part for technological reasons. So certainly we have to pay attention to the people who are disrupted by technological change and support them. But that's different than saying work in general is going to disappear. Here is the evidence in Canada. This shows in each given year how much businesses were investing in machinery and equipment. So that's robots and tools of different kinds as a share of GDP. And then on the vertical axis, on the y-axis, how fast was employment growing? And there's no clear pattern. It's kind of a jumble. There's a slight positive trend, which generally means the more you invest in machinery, the stronger the economy is and the more jobs it's creating. And that's exactly counter to the idea that jobs are going to be eliminated by robots. But it's not a strong relationship. But I wouldn't say this is the best way to create jobs, is just try to get companies to invest more in machinery. But frankly, it is more of a positive than negative. Another aspect to this is to distinguish between work and jobs. I've been referring to work in a generic sense as productive human activity, using our brains and brawn to produce the goods and services we need in order to survive and thrive. A subset of work is what we call employment or wage labor. And this is where you're hired to work for someone else. They tell you what to do. They own the value that they produce, and you get paid a wage or salary in return. And employment is a big chunk of the work that goes on in our economy, but it's not all. There are other forms of work that happen in our economy, unpaid work, for example, that goes on in our homes, caring for our children and our elders, and cooking and cleaning, and volunteer work in our communities. Also, the work that people do in a self-employed or uh, self-governing situation, like a small business person or a farmer. They're working, but not in an employment relationship. Most work in our economy is paid labor. Then we think of a job. A job is just a specific way of organizing and managing employment, specific terms and conditions regarding how much you get paid and what you're supposed to do and when you work and how you're assigned. And we've certainly seen a lot of changes in jobs. We've seen big changes in jobs. We used to think that a job was a kind of permanent standard arrangement, full time hours, usually came with benefits. You didn't necessarily have a job for life if you really screwed up, but unless something bad went wrong, there's no reason that you wouldn't keep working. And that, of course, has gone the way of the dodo bird. Less than half of employed Canadians have a permanent full time job with benefits. More people are working in part time work, in um, temporary jobs, in various forms of self employment, including very precarious self employment, and gigs. So jobs have changed in many cases for the worse. Some of those jobs, some of those features are positive in the sense that they allow some forms of flexibility, but I'd say more of them are negative. And technology has been part of the way that those changes in jobs have occurred, but technology was not the cause of it. The reason people got hired on a part-time, temporary, irregular basis to do work is because employers found out they had the power to organize it that way, and that was more profitable for them. That is about society, not about technology. Okay, let's take on the second urban myth about technology, the idea that labor-saving technology and machinery and robots and so on is accelerating. And we live in this omnipresent technological era. And it's a locomotive rolling down the tracks, and you can't stand in the way of it. Sure, you see some amazing things on YouTube videos and in controlled laboratories that technology can do. Here I have pictured one that I found the most, in a way, frightening, which is a robot that can assemble an IKEA chair. Look at that. Take it out of the box, identify the parts, manipulate the parts, put in the Allen wrench, and assemble that whole IKEA chair. And I found this one especially frightening because my partner saw this, my spouse saw this, and I tell you, she's looked at me differently ever since. Kind of to say, like, what do I even need this guy for? A robot can do that. Anyways, the hype that technology is accelerating and everywhere doesn't always match the reality. Again, some industries and occupations are clearly affected, but on the whole, across the economy, in recorded economic data, there's no evidence that technology is accelerating, that we're investing more in machinery and machinery and equipment, including robots, or the labor productivity is accelerating thanks to those robots. No evidence. In fact, if anything, the evidence suggests the opposite. So here's the data on Canadian business and their investment in technology, both tangible technology embodied in machinery and equipment, including robots, and intangible technology, that is the knowledge that can be embodied in intellectual property of various kinds, including computer software and formulas for pharmaceuticals and other know-how. And in both cases, particularly in machinery and equipment, business is doing a lot less innovation, not more. In fact, as a share of GDP, machinery and equipment investment in Canada has fallen in half since the turn of the century. I will point out that that is about the time, 2001, in fact, when the Canadian government began to deeply cut company income taxes. Tax rates in Canada have been cut almost in half since then for companies. And the whole argument for doing so was to get them to invest more. That was the whole argument. And man, has it backfired. Even the intellectual property, R&D and coding and all that kind of stuff, very weak since about the same time, since about 2001. I've thought a lot and done some research about why this has happened. I think it's a terrible thing. I don't think it's good. for workers, that companies aren't investing in this stuff. We're worse off because of it, not better off. Um, we're falling behind the rest of the world as well. Again, since about that same period, our overall R&D investment shrinking well below 1% of GDP compared to OECD average in other industrial countries of almost twice as much. So we're falling behind the rest of the world. And again, this is not a good thing. My analysis suggests a couple of things to blame. One was there was a whole dot-com collapse. For those of you old enough to remember, Canada had a big digital sector. I mean, we still do. We're still a major player, but not as big as it used to be when we had Nortel Networks and JDS Uniphase and other big companies based in Ottawa and elsewhere in Canada putting huge amounts of money into R&D. The dot-com collapse hurt that badly. Most of those companies are now broke, and we've never recovered in terms of our innovation activity. The other big problem was later on, a little bit later, 2002 is when the whole energy boom or the petro boom started, and the price of oil started to skyrocket globally, and we had a huge expansion in energy extraction in Canada, based mostly in Alberta, mostly on the oil sands. And that diverted, I think, the attention and resources of our business community away from innovation. They found they could get awfully rich doing something rather non-innovative. That is, dig stuff out of the ground beneath our feet and sell it into world markets. So, big issues there. There's no obvious single solution to them, but I do think this is a critical issue that economic policy needs to address in Canada. That is to get more innovation, particularly for things other than those staple resources. And this shows the record of productivity growth in Canada, how much real goods and services are produced with each hour of labor. And in the post-war decades, so the 50s, 60s, 70s, the labor productivity was growing at 2% or more per year. That slowed dramatically in the 80s, a bit of an uptick in the 90s, but then slowed back down since the turn of the century. And that's a very poor rate of labor productivity growth. We should be able to do better than that. And if we manage it appropriately, that would contribute to higher standard of living. But it's been pretty stagnant. And I think that's another sign of weakness of the failure of technology rather than the acceleration of technology that we're all paying for. Same goes if you look at the makeup of employment moving forward. This is also really surprising. This is from the federal government's own occupational projections for 10 years into the future. The latest one they did was in 2018. Obviously, COVID has affected some of these numbers a lot. These are the 12 occupations that will see the most growth in jobs over that decade. And is it all technology? Is it all coders? Is it learning computers and that's going to do it for you? Well, some of it is, but not that much, frankly. The dark blue are the two tech-related occupations, ICT analysts and computer programmers and designers. Those are the only two that are really what you'd call a traditional high-tech job. The other 10 fall into two broad categories. One of them, the pink, is human and caring services. So a lot of healthcare in there, social services, teachers. So that's by far the biggest source of new work in the future is caring for each other. Now, of course, those jobs use technology, but they're not about coding and robots. They're about caring for other human beings and doing it as well as we can. The last four on the list, the light blue ones, are what I would consider low tech and generally low paid private sector service jobs. So we see food, we see cleaners, we see transport truck drivers, and we see cashiers. So in the retail, hospitality, building service, transportation sector. Lots of new work for very low paid and in most ways low tech jobs. So the jobs of the future do not really fit with that stereotype of high tech work, and that if you learn the right code, you'll have a secure future. Only two of those 12 were the sort of traditional vision of high tech jobs. They only made up 15% of the jobs created by those 12 top industries. If I broaden that list and went to the next 12, none of them fit that stereotype. So most jobs are being created in human and caring services and in private services. And our task in both of those cases is to make sure those jobs are adequately funded, adequately paid, adequately protected. Okay, the third urban myth that I'm taking on, I'll just have a quick glance at my watch here. Yeah, I'm just past the halfway point. The third myth is the idea that technology is not necessarily about what we produce, but more about how we produce. In particular, how do we work with other human beings in what we produce? And this is where we need to have a little bit of a look at history and a little bit of a look at how the power relationships in our society work. Employers have always used technology not necessarily to boost output, but more to control the workplace and kind of keep workers in their place and make sure that workers are doing what the employer wants them to do. This is being applied today, just like it was applied 200 years ago, to change the employment relationship and, in a way, reinforce the power that employers have over the people who are actually doing the work, including how tasks are managed and allocated and coordinated, how workers are paid, how hiring occurs, how we supervise workers, and when the boss decides how we fire them. Sometimes in certain occupations in Canada today, you can be hired and fired by an app and never actually see your human supervisor. That's what happens to gig workers all the time. So these are ways that our technology isn't changing the actual work that we're doing or the efficiency or productivity of that work, but it is changing how we relate to other people. And it does affect our standing, if you like, or our security or our position in that. We are seeing a situation where, again, this kind of contradiction between the potential of modern technology to do incredible things and the capacity of our labor market to create some of the most menial, unproductive, low tech, and low paid jobs imaginable, including those ones that we just listed, the people working in fast food and cleaners and cashiers. Because of the way that we've organized our labor market and organized our society, it's profitable for firms to employ people to do that stuff. And even when they say, this is the amazing part, even when they say there's a terrible labor shortage and they can't find people to do the jobs, they're still applying and assigning people to do jobs that are incredibly menial and low tech and unproductive. And that fits in very well as well with that change in jobs that I talked about, away from sort of full-time permanent jobs with benefits towards insecure work, part-time jobs, gigs, and so on. So we see the situation where people are paid to hold a sign, and you can actually walk around a big city downtown and find people being paid to hold a sign. And that, to me, is proof the minimum wage is not nearly high enough. Either that, or these people aren't even getting the minimum wage; they're getting something less, cash in hand. But there are some incredibly inefficient things that are still profitable for employers to do because of this very inadequately regulated labor market. And we have seen over the last generation the erosion of the institutions which supported work and workers and helped them get a share of the wealth that they produced. And the erosion of those institutions, not technology, is what explains why we've seen growing inequality and very poor living standards among many people doing those tough, insecure, precarious jobs. We can't blame technology for inequality. We can only blame society for inequality. There's a lot of discussion, of course, about technology and the quantity of jobs, and I kind of explained why I'm skeptical of the idea that robots are going to eliminate many jobs and create mass unemployment. Another issue is, how does technology affect the quality of jobs? And this again is where the way that technology is wielded and who wields it and who they're accountable to and how much the rest of us have a say is totally relevant here. So you see the misuse of technology in places like the Amazon warehouse that I mentioned, to speed up work, to lean production, to take away chances to rest, to take away any creativity from the job. Lots of downsides of that: physical safety, ergonomic problems, mental stress, and so on. Also, indirect effects in terms of the impact of that use of technology on the employment relationship, including with gigs and so on. I think an underexplored and frightening dimension of technology in workplaces is the way that digital technology has been used to intensify surveillance and discipline over workers. In the olden days, the boss would hire a supervisor, a really crabby supervisor, to walk up and down the factory and, tap people on the shoulder and say, work faster, et cetera, et cetera. That wasn't always the most effective for various reasons, not least being you had to pay the supervisor. Nowadays, with digital technology, you can have the supervisor everywhere and you don't really have to pay them either. So you've got closed circuit TV, you've got global positioning system chips on your ID card at work. You've got technological and digital ways to monitor how fast you're working. And again, you can even use technology to supervise people, to send the warnings that you're not working fast enough, or even to fire you. And this misuse of technology to intensify work, I think, is offensive on many grounds, including the privacy and dignity of people doing that work. And I'm sure as humanists, you can see the downside there. There's also an economic side effect, which is very negative. Employers have always used a mixture of positive incentives and negative punishments to try and elicit maximum performance and retention and other aspects of good labor force management, a mixture of carrots and sticks, if you like. And the digital surveillance phenomena is a kind of stick, and it's a really cheap and omnipresent stick. So without paying a lot of money, they can take the low road in terms of how they manage and supervise and discipline their workers, instead of trying to reward good performance with higher wages. Instead, you've got apps that can tell how fast you did the job and punish or even fire you if you didn't do it fast enough. And in that sort of situation, the carrots become less important in the employer's eyes. And I think that's one of the reasons that wage growth has been a lot weaker in recent years than it should have, given the overall macroeconomic situation. If employers are using less of the carrot and more of the stick, then the workers are going to experience certainly much more negative work experiences, but also less income. Okay, the fourth urban myth that I'm going to take a peek at here, I'm just going to wet my whistle with my Tim Hortons double here, being a good Canadian, is the whole gig economy and this phenomena. And is it transforming work? Are we all going to be working gigs in the future? I'm not even of the view that gig work is a new phenomenon at all, frankly. There's ways in which gig work has been around for centuries. The key features of gig work are the following five. There's no commitment to ongoing work. You're paid, you're hired on a as needed basis to do a particular job. So you're on call or on demand. Secondly, you aren't paid a wage or salary for your time. You're paid a little payment for each job that you perform, each fare that you drive, each food order that you deliver. Third, it's up to the worker to provide the equipment and the workplace. If you're driving Uber, it's your car. If you're delivering food, it's your bike. If you're doing gig work at home, you supply the room and the computer and the power and the utilities. The fourth point is there's a kind of a triangle between the person doing the work, the gig worker, the end user of the work. That could be a consumer if it was delivering food. It could be another business if they've used a gig type system to hire people for different input functions. And we see that happening all the time now, including with companies like Amazon or IKEA. IKEA uses gig models to do the home delivery instead of hiring people. And then the third corner is the intermediary or so-called middleman, which in the modern gig economy is the platform, the digital platform, which connects the worker with the end user of the worker's services. Finally, we assume, because it's a modern economy, there has to be some kind of digital technology involved in it, a smartphone or a website or something else. And, to that, I say, whoopee doodle do. Everybody uses computers and cell phones and texts and other forms of digital technology, so that's hardly a great feature. The first four on that list have been around for hundreds of years, literally. So the idea of people working at home using their own equipment, that is hundreds of years old. This is a picture from the old, what was called the putting out system in Europe in the early days of the Industrial Revolution, where people would work at home using their own machinery, in this case, a loom, produce, first of all, they'd go and pick up the raw materials from the merchant who was employing them, take the raw materials home, transform them into something, textiles, clothing, small housewares, then take the finished product back to the merchant and get paid for the work they did, and then hope for another gig. So that is the gig economy right there, 100%. The only thing missing is a smartphone to coordinate the work, call the people in for the next gig, and pay them. That's how the smartphone works. So let's give her a smartphone, okay? And now we have a high-tech gig system for this system called the putting out system. I could call it puttingout.com. That would be the name brand for it, puttingout.com. Except I'm sure people would take it the wrong way, knowing how people are online. Piecework, where you pay people for each unit of output rather than by the hour, is as old as the hills as well. Employers have used piecework systems to try and get people to be their own boss and speed up as fast as possible. It works in some settings, it doesn't work in others. There's lots of cases where piecework isn't very effective, where people have to work in teams, or where quality is more important than quantity. But there's nothing new there. The idea of working on an on-demand basis when you're needed, also as old as capitalism or even older. This is a picture from Sydney, Australia, where we have our other office of our Center for Future Work, an old system called the Hungry Mile. The Hungry Mile is what they call the old dock area and the port of Sydney. And in the olden days, even as recently as the 1920s, hundreds of dock workers would go down there every morning and hope to get tapped on the shoulder to have a day's work unloading or loading the ships. That was how they staffed longshore work back then. Horribly insecure and exploitive, and not very safe either. In fact, luckily, we've done away with that because it's very important that people know what they're doing, and we've got proper security and everything for loading and unloading ships. But that system was very common in mining and agriculture and manufacturing and other places. Finally, this idea of a triangulated relationship between the workers, the end users of that service, and the middleman, also as old as the hills. This is the picture of the old Gangmaster System in the UK in the 1700s and 1800s, where a gangmaster would round up a few hungry workers, take them out to a farm or a factory, put them to work, and then keep half their wages for himself. So this idea of labor hire or gangmaster intermediation as old as the hills. So the key features of gig work are not new. Gig work and other forms of insecure or precarious work, as we talked about, have been eroding this kind of standard idea of what a job is. We could call it the standard employment relationship if we wanted to be highfalutin about it. The idea that you worked for one employer on a permanent basis, and you knew when you were going to work indefinitely, and you had benefits that came with it. That was a standard relationship. It became more important, the standard relationship, during the 20th century, especially after World War II. That's when employers started using less of the gangmaster system and more of permanent jobs with benefits for various reasons, including you had to have skilled workers in the right place at the right time to operate a factory, and labor markets were very tight in the 50s and 60s and 70s. I'm starting to sound like an oldies goldies disc jockey, I think. The greatest economic policies of the 50s, 60s, and 70s. But that was a time when employers had to compete with each other to keep labor and offer it a better deal. And it was also a time when capitalism faced a worldwide competition with another system. So they felt compelled to offer a better deal and show that people could live well. All of those things have changed nowadays, and you have technologies where people can do their jobs in a very dispersed way without the need for the same skills. And labor supply, even despite the employers' complaints these days of a labor shortage, there's always hundreds of thousands of people desperate, willing to work for less. And workers' expectations have been clawed down so that they don't expect a full-time job with benefits. So gig work is nothing new, and the rise of gig work after the previous fall of gig work reflects changes in society and power and politics more than changes in technology. Okay, the last the last urban myth related to training and technology and jobs is this idea that skills are the magic bullet. It's quite wrong to think that just investing in skills will solve all our problems. First of all, the economy is not held back by lack of skills. Canadians are better educated than they've ever been, and by some measures, the best educated workers in the world. And most people don't use the full skills that they have. So getting more skills in itself isn't going to solve the problem. It's certainly not going to create the jobs for skilled workers. You know, there are jobs created in obviously the education system if we do more training, but you won't automatically create the jobs where people can use their skills. It is true that people who get more skills are better off than people without skills, but that isn't necessarily because their skills are necessary. More, it's that they jumped to the head of the line of people trying to get a job. If you have 100 resumes for every available job on your desk as an employer, you're going to pick people who've got more education, and you get a kind of credential inflation going on. And the whole part of this skills agenda that I really dislike is this thing that it allows you to say if you're unemployed, it's because you didn't get the right skills. And that's just absolutely wrong, especially at a time when governments haven't invested enough in training and vocational education in colleges and universities. For sure, training and retraining can be very positive as the labor market adjusts to new technologies and new ways of working. There are going to be some jobs lost. I disagree that robots are going to eliminate work entirely, but there are some jobs that are going to be lost, and there are going to be some new jobs, like programmers of apps, that are created. And what we want is a commitment to, first of all, creating lots of jobs, lots of decent jobs, and then training and retraining can help you connect available workers with good jobs. So it's a part of the solution for sure. It is not a magic bullet. It needs to be part of an overall labor market strategy to create enough good work for everyone to have a good job and not only have the skills, but use the skills in their job. A great example of very effective integration of training policy into overall economic strategy is in Germany, where they have an amazing system of apprenticeships and registered trades and pipelines that take students as they go through a college. They learn one of more than 1,000 different recognized trades, and then they get good jobs at the end of it. So that attention of concentrating on the overall package rather than using skills as a sort of individualistic solution has worked very well in Germany. Lots of partnerships at play there, and the youth unemployment rate was 7%, about half of ours in Canada. So I think we could learn a lot from that sort of planning, labor market and vocational training planning in Germany. Skills and training are not a magic bullet, but they are part of the solution and can help to lift the quality of work over time, particularly if it's combined with efforts to lift standards, including qualifications and credentials in different jobs to create professions and careers rather than just jobs. Okay, let me wrap up in the few minutes that we've got left here. I think we're following our schedule appropriately. I want to put technology in its place and how I understand technology and its impact on labor, work, and jobs. This is an analogy. This is from Terminator. Some of you might be old enough, like me, to remember this analogy where the machines come down to take over the planet. We do not live in the world of Terminator. The machines are not in charge. We are in charge. Technology is human knowledge. Humans invented technology. Humans made choices about what problems they wanted to solve with technology. So humans influenced the path that technology took. And of course, humans control how technology is implemented and how the costs and benefits are shared. So quite consistent with the philosophy of humanists. Let's put the human at the top here, including understanding that technology itself is a human phenomena, not a technical phenomena. And whether technology helps us or hurts us, both are possible. It depends on who's in charge and who's making the decisions about what problems are going to be solved. Are we going to use technology to get a vaccine that saves millions of lives? Or are we going to use technology to extract 10 more seconds every minute of productive labor effort from somebody working in a warehouse? Those are crucial choices. And understanding that those are choices, it's not inevitable what we do. We can choose what to do. And then balancing out the power over those decisions will allow us to both enhance the benefits of technology and reduce the costs and ensure that both the costs and benefits are shared more evenly across society. So just to wrap up, I think that we have to be a bit skeptical about technology and whether we're being driven by technology. No evidence that technology is speeding up in a macroeconomic sense. Technology is not replacing labor. It can't replace labor. We can't have an economy without workers. Most of the problems that we currently ascribe to technology, like the insecurity of gig jobs, for example, or the health and safety risks of working in a technologically driven warehouse, or the growing inequality that we see in parts of society, those problems are not due to technology. They're due to society and social relationships. And we should understand that so that we don't let society off the hook. If we accept the technological determinist story of what's happening, we're making ourselves powerless because we all know we're not going to stop technology. People who've tried to actually stop things from happening haven't been very successful where that's concerned. We can redirect and manage technology very differently. But that's all about social decision making, not about ones and zeros. I think the future of work is going to look a lot like the past of work. That is to say, an ongoing conflict or struggle between employers who want to get the most labor out of people for the least cost and the rest of us who want a decent life. We want to work productively. We want to because we know it's the basis of our potential prosperity, but we want to work safely. We want work to be tolerable, creative, even fun. And we want to have time and security so that we can enjoy the fruits of our labor with our families, our loved ones, and our friends and our communities. And that is a fundamental difference of opinion, a fundamental conflict of interest that is as old as our economic system. It's centuries old, and those issues have been debated for centuries, and we're still going to debate them. How do we put limits on the workplace and the nature of work so that it's safe and enjoyable and fair? And in that regard, the future of work will not be determined by technology. The future of work will be determined by us. The future of work is what we make it. So I will conclude that overview and presentation. I thank you for your attention. And Anna, I stand ready for the Q&A and discussion and debates that I'm sure we'll have. Thank you very much.
Perfect. Thank you so much, Jim. That was very interesting and definitely much appreciated the humanist perspective that you bring to this conversation, as opposed to the GDP focused perspective. So if just a reminder that if you have questions, you can raise your hand and ask it directly. I will ask you to unmute yourself, or you can type your questions in the Q&A tool. If you can use the Q&A box at the bottom of the screen and not the chat, that would be great, so that we can keep all these questions in one place. And I see, yeah, a couple of questions are coming in. Maybe I can begin with a question of my own, which is, so you say that around half of all workers now experience at least one dimension of precarity in their work. And I've been also following the work of Evelyn Forget, a professor of economics, who says that in 2015, almost 1/3 of Canadian jobs were for contingent workers. So do we have data on what sectors of the economy are the most and least precarious? I mean, I guess it's obvious that Amazon and Uber type of companies are always in the media, in the public conversations. but we also know that adjunct professors have very precarious jobs, right? So is there data on that to just put this into perspective?
There is data, Anna, but it's imperfect and incomplete data. We don't have enough information about precarity in work and the different forms that it takes, and the categories of our conventional statistical surveys and so on that Statistics Canada puts out. The categories aren't always right either. So, a shorthand way of trying to measure precarity is to get that issue that I had. What share of the population has full-time permanent work with kind of normal benefits? And it's possible to measure something like that, but even that's not capturing the whole thing because there are ways that even full-time permanent jobs have become more precarious as well in the nature of what they're asked to do and how secure their jobs really are. In fact, we've had a problem where researchers have done surveys and asked, "Do you have a permanent job or not?" And people would say, "Yes, my job is permanent," if they were on a one-year contract, because precarity is so prevalent. They thought a one-year contract was pretty much permanent, but clearly it's not a permanent job. So lots of work needs to be done, I think, to refine our statistical categories and the information that we have. Nevertheless, we do know where precarity is very widespread. Private sector services have long been a source of precarious work, and not just with gigs either. Cleaning, security, drivers, things where employers are able to tap into pools of underutilized, desperate labor and hire them for specific tasks without making any promises about the stability of the job or benefits or so on. So, cleaning, for example, building cleaning has long been rife with very exploitative arrangements where people are set up as contractors rather than employees, and in essence compelled to work for less than minimum wage as a result. The gig economy phenomena, of course, is common as well. But you do see increasing precarity across the board, even as you say, in highly skilled occupations like academic work. So it is a very widespread phenomenon, and we do need to get better statistics to describe exactly how widespread.
Okay, thank you. A question from Brad. What are your data sources that you used in this presentation in terms of quant information?
Okay, I'm just thinking back to what were the charts and graphs that were there. The data on investment in innovation, that might have been one of them. That is machinery and equipment investment, innovation investment, R&D investment. That's all from Statistics Canada. The OECD graph, that is from the OECD itself. They collect data on R&D spending across different industrial countries. There was a graph on employment change versus machinery and equipment investment. That's also from Statistics Canada. If anyone wants the specifics on that, send me an email, info at centerforfuturework.ca. That comes to me, info at centerforfuturework.ca. That was the domain for our center, and I'd be glad to share this specific statistical sources.
Okay, thank you. A question from Elka. We are training computerized objects to think and make choices and develop new ideas. Could such creatures take over? And I guess a similar question, do we fully understand the consequences of AI making decisions?
Yeah, well, that's a good question, and I have to say one that I don't have the answer to. I was probably a bit flippant in saying we're not in the world of Terminator where the machines are in charge. We are seeing the development of AI technologies where computers can exercise judgment and learn from their own experience. So this is different than other machines that just had to be programmed to do a precise task. So, I know there's a bit of a debate among ethicists as well as computer scientists about what this means in the long run. I would say personally, I'm skeptical of the idea that the computers can actually learn to think and do everything that we do and will somehow outsmart us. But I don't know enough to say that that's impossible. I do know that most of the current world applications of AI are to do things that, you know, really don't affect our lives that much. AI, well, I guess I shouldn't say don't affect our lives that much. They do things that we wouldn't identify as being critical, but maybe they do affect our lives, like algorithms that tell you that program what social media feed comes across your phone. That's one of the biggest applications of AI, and it's just really to promote advertising. So uh, in that regard, I'm a little bit skeptical of what AI is good for so far, but that doesn't mean it can't be applied in very nefarious ways unless it's regulated. And I do think that there's a whole field of regulating technology, including in the workplace, but including other areas of our lives that has to be explored. Um, some of my colleagues in Australia have started an institute called the Center for Responsible Technology, which is looking at those issues directly. And I think there's other work like that going on around the world.
Next question. What should educational institutions such as universities be doing now to prepare for the future of work?
Well, universities are going to be very important, as I mentioned. Skills, I think, are needed, and more capacity in training is going to be needed, not just at universities either. I think, if anything, in Canada, it's colleges and vocational training that has been really starved of resources and attention. Um, I'm a great believer in universities, but I think that we probably need even more of an increase in emphasis on vocational education pathways and colleges in Canada. All of them are going to be critical in terms of preparing workers to, work and produce and have the right skills in the future, but also to learn and adapt and think and criticize. And I do think that we hear calls from time to time, usually from businesses and other sort of conservative forces, that we have to discipline universities so that they teach stuff that's actually useful in the economy. And even in Ontario, you've seen the Ford government playing around with ideas that a university's funding will depend on how many of its graduates get placed in in certain jobs afterwards, and other things like that. And that view of viewing higher education as just very, very focused on learning a particular skill for a particular job is quite wrong for lots of reasons. One of them is employers even want more than just somebody who knows how to program a certain code. Employers want people who can think and conceptualize and communicate and work in teams. And these are things that have real value in a job. They're so-called soft skills, but they matter. I reject that characterization as soft skills. So for those reasons alone, you need to do more than learn just a very specific, narrow technical skill. Similarly, because of how technology changes, you can't predict now that a particular skill that you're learning, a narrow skill like a certain coding language, is even going to be relevant by the time you graduate, let alone 5 or 10 or 15 years into your career. So this is where a capacity to learn and adapt in a way becomes critical. Then, of course, there's a whole issue of democracy and society and culture. We want education not just because it trains us to do particular jobs. We want education because it equips us to be fully capable human beings, members of a community, citizens of a country. So, for all those reasons, I think skills and technology are vital. Universities and colleges are going to play a critical role, but we can't think of it narrowly in terms of training people to do particular jobs.
Glenn is asking, does the concentration of wealth and monopolies change the power of labor? And how is this affected by the present functioning of our democracies?
Hmm. Oh, that's a great question, Glenn. Thank you. Yes, yes, and yes. It certainly does. We have seen I would say, the growth of corporate power in general, and the growth of a particular group of corporations, and that does have consequences on work and workers and labor markets and democracy itself. So, the total market value of the five biggest companies now makes up over a quarter of the New York Stock Exchange, the S&P 500, the broad measure of corporate value. Five companies, over a quarter. So of course, you know who that is. That's Apple, that's Microsoft, that's Amazon, that's a couple of others. I've forgotten. Google, of course. Um, and they wield that power in some cases without that many workers either. Amazon employs a lot of people. Amazon is still depends very much on direct labor. Some of the others don't employ that many people, certainly not relative to their market value. Instead, they've mastered the art of outsourcing and networks and supply chains. And they use their power and scope to do terrible things. So there's economic research now on Amazon. It's become such a big employer. There had been similar studies on Walmart. There are entire towns or counties in the US that depend so much on the location of a Walmart or the location of an Amazon fulfillment center that they can actually suppress the overall level of wages in that entire region because of the power of those large corporations. Now there's benefits and efficiencies that come from it. That Amazon is successful precisely because you can go on Amazon and find anything you need very quickly. But that is in a way, a natural monopoly. That means that the size of your network gives you power in ways that we haven't experienced before, and that includes power over your workers. So it also includes power over our democracy, and we've seen that with Facebook. That was the one on the five I missed. Facebook and how it influences our political discussion and discourse, and the use of algorithms and the side effects of algorithms on everything from teenage mental health to the rise of right-wing neo-fascist groups. So absolutely, these corporations have far too much power, and they need to be closely regulated, and in some cases broken up. And that'll be essential to our democracy and to the ability of workers in the future to get a fair share of the incredible wealth that these things create. Amazon, on one level, is an unbelievably efficient, productive organization. The amount of central planning and the efficiency that goes into being able to have one catalog with so many different things is incredible. And that's incredible wealth that should be shared with consumers, obviously, who benefit from that service, but also the workers. But instead, Amazon has the power to keep people working in near intolerable situations for $15 an hour. And they say, why complain? $15 an hour is above the minimum wage. Whereas in the olden days, when a company had a recipe that was fantastically profitable, like, say, General Motors in the 1950s, the workers could go after them and get a good share of it. With Amazon, the rules of the game have been tilted so that power ends up in Jeff Bezos's pocket and the other investors, rather than the people doing the actual work. And that has to change. And challenging the concentrated power of those companies is at the center of it.
A question from Mike Mackey. You mentioned German trade unions. Their co-management system are Canadian unions mature enough to do the same thing? And I guess a related question from Patty. Can the power of choice to put human needs at the center of work and job development be instituted as a more attractive choice for new economic investors and developers, following Germany's model?
Wow, these are the most sophisticated questions. Holy cow. Thank you. And if that's the Mike Mackey I know from the past, hello, Mike. Could be more than one Mike Mackey, of course. Anyways, okay, on the German question, are Canadian unions mature enough to do things, some of those collaborations, the way the Germans do? That's a very thoughtful question. In Germany, you've got a whole system that's called co-determination, where first of all, the right of workers to have representation in the workplace is constitutionally protected. That in and of itself is a great step forward. So every workplace above 50 has to have a workers' council that's created in it, and elected delegates who are paid by the company to go around and represent the workers' concerns, and they negotiate with the company on specific things in that workplace. Larger companies are required to have workers on their boards of directors, up to almost 50% of the boards of directors for large companies. Interesting thing, Aaron O'Toole proposed a very watered down version of this in his platform in the election that we just had. He said every company in the federal jurisdiction, so this is airlines and banks and so on, would have to have a worker rep on their board of directors. Unless it's backed up with the whole structure, that ends up being kind of tokenism. But interesting that that idea got picked up there. And then that's supplemented. Germany isn't the only place this happens, by the way. It's also in Switzerland and Austria and different versions of it in France and Italy and elsewhere, with sector-wide collective bargaining systems whereby unions then negotiate wages and benefits for all the workers in a particular industry. It does require, I think, unions that are thoughtful and well organized and well educated and strong relationships with employers that you can work through those issues. I believe that Canadian unions, by and large, are certainly capable of doing that, and there's various ways in which they do already. But the problem in Canada is the labor laws are kind of hostile, so that in many cases unions have to fight for their right to exist, and that shapes and constrains, I think, the nature of the collaboration that can be undertaken with employers, because unions might be, trying to negotiate something with an employer, but at the same time, they have to realize the employer would destroy the union if they could get away with it. And that shapes the way that they engage. So if unions were constituted fairly and firmly as a legitimate and permanent partner in these things, there's no reason we couldn't do those kind of things in Canada. Anna, you'll have to remind me of the second question on that list. I know it had to do with learning from Germany, but I forget what.
Yes, the question was about putting human needs at the center of work and job development.
Right.
If economic investors and developers could be convinced that this is a great idea.
Yeah, well, human needs should be put at the center of it, because meeting human needs is the whole point of the economy. So absolutely. How do we do that? And can we do it by just convincing investors and employers of that? On that score, I'm cautious. I think there are ways in which, through corporate social governance and other strategies, investors and employers can be sensitized to the other issues that they have to take on and address and take into account in their decisions. But I don't think that kind of educating them and opening their eyes a bit to issues about human rights or fair treatment or fair labor practices, environmental sustainability, I don't think just opening their eyes is going to be enough. I think they're going to have to be pushed and prodded and in some cases compelled to take these things into account. And that's why I think direct regulations in terms of how businesses behave are very important. That kind of educating them and putting resolutions to shareholders meetings and so on can be part of a cultural change for sure. But I think they ultimately have to be backed up with regulations where society says to business, this is the minimum that we expect from you, and you have to meet that.
Okay, the next question, I guess, is for you as a labor advocate. Can Canadians do anything about factories in Bangladesh? For example, if a factory burns down or collapses or workers die, I don't think we're going to stop buying new t-shirts.
Yeah, well, that's obviously not a hypothetical question. That's exactly what happened in Bangladesh multiple times. It's horrible, and it happens in lots of other countries around the world. And what can we as Canadians do about it? I guess there is a role for things like ethical supply chain sourcing. And I know that those tools have been mobilized in part in response to those tragedies in Bangladesh and elsewhere. The pressure that was put on Canadian companies like Joe Fresh and the Loblaws Group, which sourced some of its clothes from those factories, to say, if you're going to sell these things in Canada, you got to investigate the conditions under which they're produced and meet at least some minimum standards. So I think that those strategies have a potential, not full potential. ultimately, it's going to change in Bangladesh because the workers in Bangladesh rise up against those um, conditions and put in place decent decent conditions and regulations for minimum treatment. And that's where perhaps the best thing Canadians can do is support Bangladeshi workers' movements with solidarity and material support, and make position the struggles for fair treatment at work as an international struggle, not just a workplace struggle or a national struggle. It absolutely is an international struggle.
Thank you. There is a question that I must ask as we actively follow the national conversation on guaranteed basic income or universal basic income, which I guess are not the same things, but what is your take on it? Do you support it? If yes, why? If you don't, why not? And in your opinion, what are some of the bad and good arguments against it?
Hmm. Oh wow, that's a great question. We can do our own webinar on that one.
I know it's
And
like, yeah, we did one with Evelyn
oh, you
Forget.
did,
So if you
you
guys
did
want to check
already,
it out, yeah,
right?
but yeah, there's a need for more, definitely.
Uh-huh.
It's a divisive issue, right? As we've,
Yeah.
yeah.
Well, I mean, at its simplest and most generic, the idea of a basic income is that every person in society should be guaranteed a minimum standard of living that's just decent and allows them to be healthy and participate fully in society and fully in life. And that is a core idea that I'm 100% in favor of. In a country as rich as Canada, there is no excuse for people to have to live in poverty, whatever the reason and whatever the circumstances. Um, so we need to strengthen our social safety net so that everyone can meet a minimum standard. And the experience of the last 18 months with the pandemic has been insightful in this regard. First of all, we learned a bit about what that minimum standard might be. The CERB, the emergency benefit that was brought in at the beginning of the pandemic, was set at $500 a week or $2,000 a month, and it turned out that that wasn't a bad guess. On 2,000 a month, most people could meet most of their needs, and it was certainly a step up from provincial welfare payments and some of the other stopgap measures that are out there. So that was one thing. Secondly, we saw that society could actually do this. Amazing to think of it, but poverty went down in Canada quite a bit during the pandemic, which is astounding and counterintuitive because we immediately rolled out some big, powerful, and reasonably generous social protections. Now, the CERB was not a basic income. It was tied to having worked in the past. You had to show that you had earned at least $5,000 in the previous year and that you were not working now because of the pandemic. And by the way, the CERB was eliminated almost a year ago at the end of September 2020. So there is no CERB anymore. There was a range of other benefits, including expanded EI, that were brought in afterwards. But the experience was interesting, I think, and has opened up a lot of people's eyes to the fact that maybe we could. And I will note that the NDP, in its platform in the election that just occurred, had that $2,000 show up as the minimum level of employment insurance benefits that should be paid out, which was, I thought, a very ambitious goal. At a generic level, basic income is a great idea. We're doing it in certain ways. There's different places in society where we have a basic income. We have it for seniors, obviously, people over 65 with a combination of OAS and GIS get something like a basic income. We have it for children with the Canada Child Tax Benefit System, something close to a basic income for children. As a result, poverty has fallen dramatically for families with children in the last several years in Canada, and poverty is very low among seniors. It's not non-existent. We need to improve it, but it's very low among seniors. We're now considering a basic income for people with disabilities at the federal level, and that would be another big step forward, I think. And perhaps over time we can gradually expand this. A couple of cautionary notes. Number one, it isn't a magic bullet for all problems, and we have to recognize that there are people out there who need more than a basic income. So any of the ideas about replacing the whole social safety net with one-stop basic income would be a mistake. There's lots of people who need more and deserve more than the basic income, and we should see it as a way of um, fixing the holes in our safety net rather than replacing all of those existing programs. The second caution on it is I don't think that technology and automation is the reason at all why we need a basic income. Often those two arguments are linked. I've seen basic income advocates say, well, all of us are going to lose our jobs because of robots, therefore we need a basic income. And that's wrong on several levels. Number one, we aren't all going to lose our jobs. Number two, people have to keep working, otherwise the economy wouldn't be there, even in an automated situation, because basic income means we're going to be buying stuff. And who's going to produce the stuff if nobody's working? So I don't think it should be seen as what we all do instead of working. We are still all going to need to work, or most of us are going to need to work. And a basic income actually helps us improve the conditions of work, because if it's set at a generous level and people know you can get a basic income without working, then it's going to compel employers to offer you more than that to work. And that will be good for people who are working. That'll be good for people who never need to use the basic income. So very complicated issue, as you hinted. Lots of nuance in there, but the generic principle is one that's 100% valid and I fully support.
Thank you. Okay, so we have 5 minutes left, and let's see if we can squeeze in maybe a couple of questions, 2 questions, 1 question. So here's a question from Rob. It's a curious one. Services that we need seem to be not well supported by real people, so you cannot often get your issues resolved because you're presented by an online algorithm. If true, could this reduce employment as businesses that provide services become less interactive or accessible?
I hear your pain. I feel your pain.
And yes, it's widely shared. I was just going to say, we all know exactly what Rob was talking about as you talk to those machines.
As you talk to those machines, and
yes.
And here's a basic mathematical truth. Okay, you cannot always be experiencing a higher than average volume of calls. Okay. The nature of an average is sometimes it's higher,
Right.
sometimes it's lower. But every time you phone, they're experiencing a higher than average volume of calls. Well, clearly, this is a strategy. The strategy was for employers, even governments have done this, right? But private insurance companies and cell phone companies and others, obviously ahead of the curve, to minimize the amount of money they pay out to actual human beings to do the work. So it certainly has resulted in job loss in those occupations, rather than hiring people who can answer these queries more efficiently. And it also shows that it isn't so much doing something more efficient. There's nothing efficient at all about having thousands of people on hold working through lengthy menus trying to figure out how to solve their problem. That's incredibly inefficient. People are wasting huge amounts of time because of this. But because the consumer's time is free, it doesn't count in the employer's calculation. So this again is just another example of how technology can be misused to make things less efficient, not more, but they make them more profitable. That's the key issue. So this is a problem. I think in a way there's an untapped potential to get people up in arms about that incredibly poor service that we experience in different ways from companies that have huge profits and huge power. And I'd like to see a Consumers Bill of Rights campaign for, where people who are clients of a cell phone, or you're flying on an airline, or buying insurance, or any of those other services, can expect fair treatment, including how their communication and inquiries are handled. That would be, I think, something worth fighting for.
Okay, if I may ask a follow-up question about the similar issue. So is it fair to say that technology restricts access to employment? I just saw some curious figures. For example, according to recent Harvard research cited by McKinsey, automated hiring systems such as CV scanners are stopping an estimated 27 million people in the US from finding full-time work. So that's 27 million people. And Evelyn Forget mentions in her recent book on basic income that, for example, in 2020, the online hiring platform Upwork had 12 million freelancers and 5 million clients. So that's 12 and 5, meaning the competition for short-term gigs is also happening at a global level, right? So it just, if we think about the level of competition and right, accessibility to employment opportunities. So is it fair to say that technology restricts access to employment?
Okay, well, there's a number of different issues at work there. One is how these AI systems work. This is an application of AI where employers scan resumes and they look for keywords. And there's lots of evidence that it's very discriminatory, that it goes against people, obviously, for whom English is a second language. And other ways, it's very insidious. The sort of person that the AI algorithm is imagining as the ideal candidate is almost always someone who's white and has a certain amount of privilege. So I agree, those systems are really insidious and wrong. Again, employers use those systems because it's cheaper than paying human beings to look through the pile of resumes that are there. Now, I wouldn't say it's restricting access to employment in a generic sense, but it's certainly making the labor market more unequal and more segmented, and that is a problem. You also mentioned the online employment exchanges, um,
Upwork. Mhm.
Upwork and others. Many of them are like gig systems in which people, are pushed to work for less to do particular tasks, things like Amazon Turk and that kind of thing. And when you can tap into a global labor market with those platforms, then it's no longer just a desperate person who lives down the street who you're competing against. It's a desperate person on the other side of the world,
Mhm.
and that's a lot of desperation. So, again, this isn't driven by technology. This is driven by greed of the employers who are doing this. And the way we will restrict it is not by banning the technology somehow, just like the Luddites threw wrenches into the machinery in the 1800s. The way we'll restrict it is by putting limits on what those employers and corporations are allowed to do, and challenging their unfettered power to use this technology in ways that maximize their own profits.
Okay, thank you. Should we take one last question, Jim? It's
Sure.
8:32, but here's a great one. How do you feel about unionization efforts in the US and now in Canada at Amazon and the wider tech sector? How can we make a humanist appeal for unionization specifically?
Yeah, well, I hinted at the union drives at Amazon in Canada. There's lots going on, and in fact, they've made one application for a certification vote at a warehouse in Alberta, of all places. That's Canada's least union-friendly province. That's my home province, I should point out. So I'm not just, you know, slagging Alberta here. And so we'll see what happens. The labor laws in general are not very hospitable to unionization. And this is another reason why. In the 1950s, when a corporation was super profitable, more likely than not, the workers would unionize and they'd drive up the wages there. That happened time and time again. And it was much easier then to unionize. There were less hoops to jump through and less opportunities for the employer to defeat a union drive. Now, especially in a place like Alberta, there's all kinds of hoops. So I'm not holding my breath for success of that Alberta application, but I sure as heck hope that it works. And then we will learn that by giving workers a collective voice, first of all, to safely express their grievances and concerns and tell the employers these are concerns with what it's like to work in your warehouse and we have to address them. And then giving them some bargaining power to negotiate and win some of those. They'll never win everything, but they can win some of them. That's how we'll do it. We published through our center a big paper on voice, employee voice, workers' voice. What is it? What does it mean to have voice in your workplace? And what are the ways that you can get it? Unionization isn't the only way, but it's probably the most important and effective way. So I would encourage folks to look at the website, centerforfuturework.ca, and look for our paper on workers' voice as part of a bigger research project we're doing called PowerShare, and some interesting stories, case studies in there about why voice matters. And I think it's entirely compatible with a humanist perspective that people at work are human beings. They are not disposable productive inputs. And being able to communicate how you feel and express your preferences and have those listened to, not just a token suggestion box. Have those listened to is part of a humanist workplace.
Okay, thank you so much, Jim, for your very informative presentation and for the great Q&A. As we wrap up our session, I'd like to mention that we are supported by membership and donations. If you would like to become a member of Humanist Canada or contribute to our educational programs, you can do so on our website, humanistcanada.ca. Just to let you know that our next webinar will take place on October 3rd at 3 p.m. Eastern Time, and we will host a panel on humanist chaplains. And for more information about the speakers or to register, please visit our website. And once again, thank you, Jim. That was great. Maybe we can have you back sometime, as this is
I'd be glad to. Thank you for what you're doing and for what you contribute to our society.
And good luck with your research, and thank you all for attending. Have a good night.
Okay. Bye-bye.
Bye.